Hey there! It is episode 8 of the Research Comms podcast, and this week we'll be hearing from one of the most influential figures in the world of British science and the communication of science, Katherine Mathieson, who's the chief executive of the British Science Association. The British Science Association, it's a bit of a tongue twister, I will I think call it BSA for short from now on, is an organisation that plays a very prominent role on the science scene over here in the UK. And in fact, it's been on the scene for close to 200 years now, which is pretty phenomenal. It was founded in 1831 as the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And its focus back then was on the communication of science, mostly amongst scientists. Since then, it's evolved considerably, and now it's a far more outward-looking organisation that seeks to engage the public with science through a variety of programmes like the British Science Week and the British Science Festival, as well as campaigns that are both offline and digital. Last week, I popped over to the BSA's headquarters in Kensington, which sit in the shadow of two of Britain's most iconic monuments, if you will, to science communication, the Science Museum and the Natural History Museum. It was a fascinating visit and had a very sort of free-flowing, all-encompassing conversation with Katherine. As you'd imagine, given her role, she's a passionate advocate of the importance of public engagement with science. So we spoke about why it matters, about the critical role that diversity has to play in science communication.
We want the best possible science to be done, not just any old science. And if we are not recruiting the talent from every corner of the globe, ideally, then we are not doing the best science we can do.
We also chatted about public debates around emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. And we also spoke a lot about the BSA's ambitious new mission to transform the relationship that millions of people in the UK have with science over the next couple of years.
It's a bit like the feeling where you go over the top of a slide, you can't go back, and the journey's going to be exhilarating and a bit scary, but really good.
So we covered a lot of really interesting areas, which means there's a great deal to listen to, and I therefore will leave you now and see you again on the other side. Katherine, thank you so much for meeting with me today. Perhaps we could start. So the British Science Association, I imagine most of the people listening to this podcast are likely to be very familiar with it, especially those who are listening in the UK. But I think what would be helpful is if you could start off perhaps by explaining a little bit about the mission of the association and what you sort of stand for.
Sure. So the British Science Association is a charity who has a vision of science being at the heart of culture and society. So we would like people, everybody, to see science in the way that people often see music or sport or the arts or other areas of human endeavour where there are a bunch of people who have a paid job, and have a professional identity within those things. And that's fine, they're all getting on with their thing. And then the rest of us, if we're interested, we feel very, very able to sort of reach out and participate. We can play sport, we can follow a team, we can campaign for sport to be done differently, to be part of the Olympics, or for women's football to be televised, or whatever we care about in connection to sport. We don't feel the need to have permission from somebody to participate. And the same with music. We're not overly influenced by our school experience of music, we're influenced by our own tastes in music, by our own experience of music. And we would like science to be more like that. So more part of everyday human culture, rather than, as is often the case now, seen as an activity where professionals kind of busy themselves by taking charge of all the science behind closed doors somewhere.
And what is it about science that you feel has meant that we're in this situation whereby people feel sort of removed from it, and it's not embedded in people's everyday lives in the same way that sport and the arts and politics and so on are?
I don't really know how we got to the place where we are now. I think it's worth saying that the sense of removal from everyday life for most people is still a very respectful one. So public attitudes to science surveys routinely find very high levels of respect and even admiration for the work of researchers. So it's not that people are disregarding it because they think it's not worthy, or that it's or fundamentally that's not interesting. People say it's valuable for society. They just often feel like it's not for them. And that seems to be a great shame for a number of reasons, actually. So we've done some surveying over the last couple of years in partnership with King's College Culture Tracker survey to look at the number of people who would say, I have an active identity in science. I participate in science festivals, I buy science books, I watch science TV programmes. That seems to be about 9% of the population. And about 25% of the population say, science is not for me. They have a very strong, that's not something that I am welcome in or that I can participate in. And actually the majority of the population, 51%, are just have quite an inactive relationship with science. They're just going about their daily lives and science is not really part of it. And so the kind of research communication that those different groups need is really different. People who are actively seeking out science and research content are going to be totally different from the people who are trying to avoid it. People who see that that's not for them.
Sure. Okay, and that's great. That brings me on to, so that's the sort of ongoing mission of the British Science Association. But recently you announced there was some news that came out about a new business plan that you have with some very specific targets that you wish to achieve over the next few years. So perhaps you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so we're in a really exciting phase at the moment. So we have been doing the vision that we have at the moment of wanting science to be seen as a fundamental part of culture and society. We've had that for a few years. We did a big strategic review in 2013, and that's the way that we've reformulated our charitable objectives. And the way that we understand what that means has changed as we've adopted that vision. So we've become, I suppose, we've looked underneath what that means and peeled back a few layers. And where we are now is being able to make a very public commitment to saying that the kind of science engagement that happens between people who have a very strong or positive relationship with science, that's important and valuable and fantastic. And we have done a lot over recent decades to shape what that looks like. And we're very proud of that. But for the next 3 years, we want to have a really firm focus on the people who don't have a strong relationship with science at the moment. So the 3/4 of the population who have a kind of inactive or not, science is not for me relationship with science. And we want to really work hard to understand the needs and the interests of those groups. And so all of our programme activities are being thought about in the light of that model and that commitment. And that commitment is also a commitment to diversity and inclusion. So we know that groups of people who have a strong kind of identity or relationship with science are not necessarily representative of the wider population, that many of the dimensions of bias and lack of privilege that operate in other spheres also operate for science. And so we want to take a very proactive stance to trying to address that, which we know means changing the BSA, the British Science Association itself, as well as our activities, the way we think about things. So that is, we don't necessarily know all of the steps that we might take, but for us, it's quite a public commitment to saying we want, that's a really core strand for what we do. It's not like an add-on activity. Yeah, okay. There's not like a special group of people with different needs and we're going to just lump an extra activity on the side for them. Yeah. We're going to think about all of our core programs, the long-standing programs, the kind of flagship programs that we're often known for, and that collectively we want those activities to, over the life of this 3-year business plan, for 4 million people who currently have a kind of inactive or science is not for me relationship, to move into having a strong I am engaged in science, or I have a professional identity in science.
That's very exciting. And I think what struck me about it was the fact that you had made this, as you said, like public declaration with some very specific targets. Yeah. So that must have been quite, when the press releases went out, how did you feel? I mean, it must have been exciting, but a little trepidatious that you've sort of put these very sort of measurable benchmarks that people can kind of hold you to.
It's a bit like the feeling where you go over the top of a slide, you can't go back. And the journey's going to be exhilarating and a bit scary, but really good. It's definitely a journey we want to make. And part of the rationale for making a public commitment around the target number of people, 4 million people is a huge number. And it is deliberately a bigger number of people than we can reach ourselves, because it illustrates a commitment to working in partnership. So we cannot do this. We could do... we have amazing programs. We could have the world's most amazing programs, and we could run them brilliantly for 3 years, and we could not, change 4 million people.
Yeah.
So we are only going to achieve that if we work in partnership with other organisations, and that's organisations within the science and research sector, and organisations beyond it. So big cultural institutions and live events and other such partners. We're doing a lot of work at the moment exploring how to best work with very local community groups, using quite small value grants and the kind of permission, I suppose. When you give somebody a grant, you give them a resource, but you also give them permission. So giving community group leaders a small grant to do their first science event as part of British Science Week, for example, then starts them on a journey of thinking, oh, science is relevant to the community that I work with. I can do some science programming with this group.
Yeah.
They'll be interested. Let's explore what we're interested in.
As you say, and so, as you say, it's not something that you're going to be able to achieve on your own. You need other people to step up to the mark as well. And I read an article that you'd written a while ago about representations of science in sort of the mass media, television and radio, and particularly you were talking at the time about the relaunch of the BBC's Tomorrow's World strand, and said although I think it's a great programme, that you were a bit disappointed by the selection of people who'd be presenting the show. It was kind of the usual suspects, the Brian Coxes and so on, who, whilst being fantastic science communicators, aren't necessarily the most relatable figures to much of the population. So when it comes to sort of people involved in the media who are making the kind of programmes and so on, how would you prefer science to be represented through those kind of channels?
So just to be clear, I am in no way critical of people like Brian Cox, who I think have done a great deal. I mean, he's one of our honorary fellows, so wouldn't be allowed to be critical anyway. But I'm not critical, because I think what he does so well is he takes a very awe and wonder approach to a topic that is traditionally considered very difficult to understand. And he has worked chiefly through TV in a way that nobody's done before. So his achievements should not be undersold. But I think there is a risk that as a bunch of researchers or research communicators, that we accidentally put up as our kind of figureheads people who look a certain way or appear to have had a certain background. So the individuals who are currently doing that, it's not about criticising them, it's about saying, how can we get a greater range? Are there pockets among our population who don't see themselves represented in science and technology? And if that's the case, how do we change that? How do we get a wider range of people represented? Because, there's something about the human brain that takes in these inferences that were not intended and builds worldviews based on that. And then we all, through unconscious bias, replicate those biases and prejudices. So there's a lot of work for us to do here. And sometimes that might feel a bit uncomfortable, where it's about challenging the status quo. Sometimes change is uncomfortable. But I think it's crucial that we get a wider range of voices and types of backgrounds and people of different appearances and all this kind of thing, who are our public scientists and engineers and researchers.
And in terms of the purpose, okay, so we know about the targets, what you're trying to achieve in terms of bringing science into the lives of 4 million more people in the next 3 years. Why is that so fundamentally important, do you think? I mean, sort of playing devil's advocate, I suppose you could say everyone has their own interests. Not everybody has to be interested in the same kind of stuff. So long as the science is being done and that people are looking for cures for cancer and solutions to climate change and all those kind of challenges, surely, most of the population can probably just get on with their daily lives and not have to worry about those things too much. Why is it so important that you bring these people into the fold, as it were?
So I think it's important for 4 reasons. One of them is to do with science, and 3 of them are to do with people, everyone else. You said just then that as long as the science is being done, then it's okay, right? We want the best possible science to be done, not just any old science. And if we are not recruiting the talent from every corner of the globe, ideally, then we are not doing the best science we can do. And we know that we can't possibly be recruiting the best talent from across the globe, because we do not have a diverse group of people working in science at the moment. So there's a very strong imperative around the kind of talent pipeline into science and the diversity of that pipeline and the kinds of people who end up working in science or not. And that is very persuasive given the importance of science to the future economy of the UK and to the kind of challenges we're trying to solve. These are challenges The things that come out of the science labs and the research spaces are the things that will determine what kind of aging and death we all have. They'll determine our future nutrition. They'll determine our, all sorts of things about our lives. So we want to do the best possible science that can be done. But there are other reasons as well for wanting more people to have a stronger connection to science, to see science as part of their culture. One is for kind of utility reasons. We all in our everyday lives make decisions based on science. We have to kind of wade through the many facts available on social media to try and make decisions about how best to arrange vaccinations for our children, or what kind of transport is going to be best for our families, or where in the world we want to live, or daily decisions that are underpinned by science. And it can be, it's not trivial to wade through the massive information that comes our way. The thing that's happened most recently around breast cancer screening, the statistics that underpin the media story for the breast cancer screening mishap are hard to understand, actually. Did I suffer, if I'm a woman in that age group, by missing the screening, or did I avoid unnecessary harm? That there's no way of knowing as an individual woman. So the more that people have access to a kind of scientific way of critical thinking and an understanding of the principles that scientists bring to thinking about those hard things, will be very useful in everyday life. There's also reasons about democracy. The decisions we take about science, the decisions we take through politics, through the levers of democracy, are often decisions about science. What's the right energy mix for the UK? How should we manage our food supply chains for optimal nutrition, but also affordability? These are all questions that relate to the work that science does. And so if only people who already like science or are interested in science take part in those bigger societal decisions, then we're not making very good effective decisions. We're not taking decisions that have everyone's interests at heart.
Yeah.
And finally,
yes,
one more reason: science can be delightful. It can be wonderful. It can be an amazing kind of cultural experience. And in the same way that we say that there is a wide and broad entitlement to the arts and those forms of culture, there should also be a wide entitlement to the culture of science.
Going back to one of those points, I think it's, as you were saying, it's not just then about giving people information. It's about giving people the opportunity to think in a sort of scientific way to approach these issues. There are, I think, some examples of ways in which science communication has been very effective at engaging people around certain debates. Like I interviewed Sir Doug Turnbull recently about his campaign to persuade Parliament and the public, obviously Parliament acting on behalf of the public supposedly, to change the law to allow the controversial fertility technique of mitochondrial donation. And that, I think, is a fantastic example of when public engagement can be used to great effect. Other examples of when perhaps it hasn't gone so well would be the debate around genetically modified food that now went in such a way that public fear around the issue has meant that sort of scientific progress has not been able to continue as it could have done and to benefit the world as it could have done. So how do we go about communicating science in such a way, especially when it comes to future debates around things like or current debates around things like artificial intelligence, so that we don't make the same mistakes that perhaps we did around genetically modified foods?
So I think that's a fascinating question, and there's a number of issues wrapped up in it. So one of which is that the debate around public permission for mitochondrial donation to go ahead. That was an example, I think, of a really well-executed, well-planned, well-executed public engagement strategy led by the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, who had the foresight to see that technology coming down the track and notice that it was likely to be it had the potential to be very controversial, because for its entire existence, the human species has based its assumptions on the idea that you have two genetic parents, and that's what creates a new human. So having three genetic parents is completely kind of slightly mind-bogglingly new version of that. And so the potential for kind of public concern or disquiet is huge. So they had the foresight to spot that, and they did very deep and considered long-term public engagement, dialogue-based for the most part, about is this something we should consider licensing? And if so, under what circumstances? And the eventual regulatory decision was then very straightforward because of that backdrop of a huge amount of investment in finding out where the public's views were. And of course, the public's not one homogenous mass, but that model, I think, can be applied where we know what the question's going to be.
Yeah.
where there's a very specific technological advance that can be foreseen and there is time to do the engagement. In a sector, on a topic like artificial intelligence, we don't yet know what the questions are. And so we're not yet at a point to do that very careful, considered, deliberative dialogue work. And that is a challenge for us. So in a way, AI is more similar to GM in terms of public debate than it is to mitochondrial donation, in my view. I think there are some interesting similarities in terms of the debate, in the sense that a lot of research is taking place, say, in the private sector by relatively small organisations who don't necessarily participate in large amounts of public engagement.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of where we think this might go in the public consciousness is being driven by science fiction. And I'm a big fan of science fiction. I think it has a useful role as well as an entertainment role. But that does lead us to a particular place. Part of what science fiction does very well is play with the alternative futures and offer us up ideas of what that might look like, dystopian and utopian. And so when that comes to be the sea in which we're swimming when we think about AI or GM, those are the sort of touch points that we're reaching for, and that makes for a very particular kind of debate. I think one of the things we learned from the GM debate, and just to be clear, I'm not coming from a place where I think GM food ought to have been licensed back then. I'm coming from a position that was a waste of resources to have the debate in that way at that time.
Right.
The technology was at the point of being commercially licensed. It was ready to be introduced. It was introduced. And then there was a massive backlash and it disappeared. A complete waste of research, time and talent and effort to get to that point before you realise that you don't have the public buy-in.
Right.
So one of the things we learned from that was the need for upstream dialogue, engagement with the public. Don't wait until your thing's ready to go into the shops before you ask if people want it. Ask as early as possible. What are the ways in which we can use this technology? Yeah. What would you like to see from this technology?
By getting in early as well, you potentially fend off the sort of danger of it becoming kind of politicized, also sort of culturally weighted, that it's hard to sort of row back from that as well, I guess. I
think so, and I think it gives people the chance to gives people the time to think about what they do want from that technology, rather than just going, hey, you did that. We see this in the kind of recent Cambridge Analytica data scandal. Hey, I didn't know that's what you were doing with my, taxpayers' money for research or my data or whatever, whatever it was. Hang on, wait, I didn't give that permission. I didn't know you were doing that. So what we need here is to build in time. These are the kinds of things that we might be thinking about doing. Let's have a conversation about those, rather than, oh yeah, we started doing that a couple of years ago, actually, and you just didn't know. Which is a horrible, horrible situation to be in. And that's where these things become politicised, because politicians quite rightly feel the need. They're in defence mode. Then we need to defend the public from this assault by whatever.
In terms of then, so those are sort of some of the benefits and why it really matters that we're reaching a wider swathe of the population with science communication. Perhaps we could talk about some of the sort of methods in which you're planning on doing that. Obviously, my area of interest particularly is in digital communications. And I think the British Science Association, for many people, you're famous for the science festival that you do every year and sort of very on-the-ground kind of active work locally, and hundreds of events across the country, thousands of people involved, which is all amazing. But you do also see the benefit of and a role for digital communications as well, don't you? And perhaps you could talk about some of the ways in which you're sort of harnessing the power of digital to reach the kind of underserved, harder to reach audiences that you're targeting.
Sure. So I think we're at a point in a journey on this, so we don't have all the answers, not by a long way. But many of the techniques that we have developed through our kind of live events programming or our face-to-face work are also being carried over into our thinking about digital. Digital, as you implied in the question, digital has this much greater affordance to reach out to people where they already are, which is one of the key things that we've learned through our kind of live events programming. So we have a network of very committed, very talented, very energetic volunteers in our British Science Association branches, and they're right across the UK doing great work, chiefly through live events with local audiences, and they reach tens of thousands of people every quarter. And then we have this annual British Science Festival, which is one of the jewels in our crown, which brings researchers at the cutting edge to talk to public audiences about the work that we're doing. And so with the festival, using the festival as a case study, we have done quite a lot of work in the last 2 or 3 years thinking about who's coming to the festival events and who would we like to come. and what's the difference there, and making changes, tweaks really to the festival programme. So for example, we know that for some groups in the population, coming onto a university campus to take part in an event is quite a big barrier. You know, if you've not been a student at a university and you feel that that's for other kinds of people, then you might be more reluctant to come to an event that's on a campus compared to an event that's in a village hall or in a bar or, you know, in the bus station or in a place where you are much more familiar with. So we have experimented with taking events to different locations and using different formats, and then we measure what effect that has. And we talk to the people who come, so we evaluate in quite a lot of detail every event that's part of the festival. We ask people some questions about themselves and what attracted them, why they're there, and what kind of relationship they have with science. And then we ask them what they thought of the event. You know, was there too much kind of technical information? Was it too boring? Was it funny? Was it, you know, how was it? And we use that to help make further tweaks. And the same thing applies to digital content. So go to where people are already. Don't try and bring them to our website. There's quite a big chunk of the population who are never going to spontaneously Google the British Science Association and come to our website, because why would they, right? But they might be interested in a particular question or a particular person or a particular, you know, online event or whatever it is. One of the projects we've done recently is called Run the Solar System.
Yeah.
So that is a downloadable running accompaniment app. So people run, it's so the idea is that the narration lasts for the equivalent of a 10k run, and the narration by Dallas Campbell, the broadcaster, is about the equivalent of running through the solar system. Yeah. So at the beginning of your run, you're at the sun, and then you run past kind of Mercury and then Venus, and you realise just exactly how far away Pluto is because it's most...
Yeah.
And Dallas Campbell tells you these wonderful stories about what these planets are like and what the space in between is like and how we've discovered the things that we've discovered about them. And that attracted hundreds and thousands of people who don't give a stuff about astronomy, really. They care about running, and they want an interesting run. Yeah. And that was kind of fascinating. We had a live race, and some people turned up dressed like bits of the solar system. So that is about reaching people who have a passion about running and just want interesting content to run to. And perhaps in some small part, we have opened their eyes to how interesting a science topic could be. That's great. But you'll notice that the project is called Run the Solar System. It's not called Learn about the Science of the Solar System. Sure. Yeah, great. And the other thing, actually, I had kind of like the citizen science side of things and the plastic tide, for example. You've got a project. Talk a little bit about that and how that sort of is hoping could potentially reach new people as well. So we have a partnership with the Plastic Tide at the moment, and we worked with them particularly closely on British Science Week this year, and we asked members of the public to help do research. One of the things that I really like about the citizen science approach is that it's very kind of levelling. The scientists or the researchers are saying, we can't do this by ourselves, actually, and we can't even do it with the world's best computers. We need some human involvement. We need human pattern recognition skills to help us classify this data set or process this data set. Please help. And there's something very often I think there's a perception of a power imbalance between scientists or researchers and non-specialists, and that is levelled out in a citizen science scenario. And particularly the Plastic Tide researchers are so approachable that they're great role models for researchers. So they have been taking photographs of beaches across the UK using a drone, using the photographs. So Ellie, the drone pilot, has been flying the drone across all of the beaches, taking photographs. Wow. And the photographs, of course, capture litter, particularly plastic litter on the beaches. But the drone and the computer that stores the data has no idea what the pictures show. And it is surprisingly hard to tell a computer that's a piece of plastic litter, that is not, that's a rock. That's just the kind of thing that algorithms are not very good at. We've still got one up on them in that. Absolutely. And I think we will for a while. But members of the public are, of course, fantastic at doing that, much better than computers. So the idea was to ask the public for help in identifying what these photographs show so that the computer algorithm can learn. And then that capability can be used to monitor live the quality of the amount of litter or the kind of litter showing up on beaches in the UK and all over the world. And there was something about that ask that really captivated people's attention. So we set ourselves a really ambitious target. Can we get the public to help classify X number of images? I can't quite remember the figures. X number of images by the end of Science Week. And 18 hours later, they'd done it all.
Wow.
And we were like, can we release some more images? Can we do? And we ended up doing the whole lot, their whole database in British Science Week, because people really want to do something about the plastics problem.
Yeah.
And it is, apart from, we know that we need to be more virtuous about straws and plastic cups, but it's, aside from some good behaviour in our daily lives, how else can we help? What else can we do? And it's fairly rare for researchers to say, actually, you can help us with this, And so the Plastic Tide researchers are so grateful. I think they felt that they were carried on this kind of sea, pardon the marine pun, on this kind of sea of kind of love and support and practical help that they didn't really know was out there. They were just doing this research in this kind of quite aloof sort of... researchers can often feel that they're just getting on with it in the lab, and nobody really knows or cares what they're doing. And actually, people really do care. Yeah. And so to make that visible to the researchers was really powerful for the researchers. Yeah. People loved getting stuck in. And there's something strangely hypnotic about identifying litter on beaches.
I think that's really important as well, isn't it? We've been talking sort of all about the benefits of science communication to the public and how and sort of the democratized nature of it, but we haven't really spoken that much about what it can do for the scientists and the researchers themselves as well. But from that example, as you say, and many more, I think it can have a great benefit as well to be involved in public engagement, can't it? Yeah,
it can. And I think one of the things that researchers don't often expect, but does happen more than you'd probably think, is that the kinds of questions that the public ask, or the kinds of sort of spin that they put on what the researcher is telling them, can help improve the quality of the research. So the researchers often go away with, I'd never really thought about it like that, or I'd never noticed how important that my research is to this particular community, and now I'm going to think about the needs of that community more when I do, plan my research. So researchers who do, I'm sure you've noticed this similarly, researchers who do research engagement rarely do less of it as they go on. They kind of get the bug, and they see why it's important, and they see why it's good for them as researcher, and they see why it's good for the public, and why. So unless other demands impinge on their time, there's typically a kind of escalator. They do more and more and more and more, and they do different kinds. And
and get better at it.
Exactly.
Yeah. That feels like a sort of almost a lovely sort of inspirational ending point. But actually, one thing that it would be great to hear about is what advice you might have for those kinds of people who are looking to improve the effectiveness of their science communication, and perhaps if we could talk about it specifically with relation to your goals over the next 3 years, so how people can reach these sort of underserved audiences as opposed to just sort of speaking to the kind of already converted.
So I think my suggestion for researchers who are keen to do more in this area to reach underserved audiences is to think about the underserved groups of which they might already be a part. We are all complex human beings, and we might feel that we came from a particular part of the country which is underserved in terms of research engagement, or we represent a particular group based on our diversity characteristics, or there's all sorts of, we are made up of a whole complexity of different dimensions, and there'll be some of those which are underserved groups, and tap into those, so go to the communities in which we grew up, or go to the communities which, represent particular groups, and talk to them about what they're interested in and what they'd like to know more of, and make it quite an exploratory thing. Don't feel like you have to design this marvellous programme for Bengali teenagers in Oldham straight off the bat. Just go and have a chat and see what they're interested in. And let their questions and their interests drive what you then do with them. And sometimes it can be easier to volunteer, to step into a volunteering role with them, rather than kind of go in and go, I'm a scientist, what science can we do? Because they may not know how to answer that question. They may do. They may have a bunch of ideas. But if they don't, it's quite a strange question. So just go to those places, hang out with those people, have some conversations, think more deliberately about who might be present and not present in the communications that you already do. So if you give talks, think about what kind of audience did that feel like, and so who do I feel like I've never spoken to? We see this particularly in schools. So researchers who go and give talks in schools, the schools who ask more get more, The schools who ask less might need it more.
Yeah.
So think about balancing the invitations you accept with the ones that you offer to the schools who've never asked, because they just don't have the staff time to deal with that sort of thing. And there are various networks that can help help researchers with that for schools. So things like the STEM Ambassadors Network and the Speakers for Schools networks are really good tools that researchers can use. There's also a tool called sciencelive.net,
Right.
which is where organisers of science events, people who might speak at science events, and people who might volunteer at science events can all find each other.
Aha.
So researchers can create a little profile on that website and say, I'm willing to talk about neuroscience anywhere in Scotland, and I'll talk to schools for free, but anyone else is going to have to pay me, or whatever their offer is.
That's a great resource.
I can talk to anyone in August, but nobody in February.
Yeah.
You know, whatever your thing
Sure.
is, make your profile. If you're looking for something, you can put that up. You can put like a wanted advert. You know, I'm looking for somebody to be part of a double act with me around the pros and cons of pesticides in farming, or, you know, whatever. And science event organisers will obviously know that you're there then and can ask you to do things. And you get a wider sense of what's out there for the taking.
Sounds wonderful. I hadn't heard of that, so that's really good to know. Thank you. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Katherine. I'll be looking on eagerly to see how you get on with the new business plan. Is there ways that people are going to be able to kind of follow your progress through the website, presumably the blog, which is a fantastic blog? I'm always sort of keeping up to date with that. But how is that going to pan out? Will you be doing sort of annual updates about how your progress is going, or just wait until the end and let us all know then?
So we are trying to, particularly with some of our kind of diversity work, trying to show our workings as we go along. So I think what we have learned is, and there's no perfect solution, some of the issues that we're trying to address are issues that are long-standing in society. So it'd be kind of surprising if we just spent 6 months working on it and got it totally right. You know, like that. Why hasn't that been done before? Yeah. So I'm expecting us to stumble, make mistakes, you know, have to rethink things, and the best way of doing that quickly is to expose the work that we're doing. Yeah. So we want it to be a more porous process than simply we're going to go into a dark room and solve it all and then come out and announce it. And so I would encourage people to keep an eye on the blog, because that's the most likely place where we're going to put a shout out when we need a bit of help, or we need a bit of advice, or we think we've stumbled and how can we get back on track. And our website more generally, we have a couple of newsletters that we send out, which give examples, usually give news about opportunities for getting involved with our work. And our Twitter account is very lively, so I'd encourage researchers who are on Twitter to follow us there, and to come and talk to us. You know, we are quite a porous organisation because of our volunteer base, and the staff team is quite small actually. So we do rely on these wider networks. So I'd encourage people to take advantage of that and come and have a conversation.
Brilliant. Amazing. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Well. There it was. I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly found it absolutely fascinating talking to Katherine about all those different areas of science communication. Before I go, I'd just like to remind you that you can, as ever, let us know what you think about that episode and any others of the podcast by tweeting me at Orinoco Comms, spelt ORINOCO COMMS. Or, if you prefer to keep things private, by all means email me on peter@orinococoms.com. And do check out the Research Comms blog on our website, link in the description of this episode, for even more insights, information and inspiration around the theme of research communication in a digital age. Until next time, goodbye.